Let me tell you about the day a man named Harlan Voss asked an entire alien empire to wait while he made himself a cup of coffee. I was there. I saw it with my own two eyes, and even now, years later, my hands still get a little cold when I think about it. I don't tell this story often. Most people don't believe me. They think I'm exaggerating or that I've mixed up the details over time, the way people do with old memories. But I was in that room. I heard the low hum of the machines in the walls. I smelled the strange burnt metal smell that came off the alien ships parked outside our station, a smell like a coin left too long in the sun. And I watched a tired man in a wrinkled shirt stare down the most powerful beings in the known galaxy and say, plain as anything, "Give me 5 minutes. I need coffee." I'm going to start from the beginning, because if I don't, none of it will make sense. And this story deserves to make sense. People should know what happened. They should know how close we came, and they should know the name of the man who saved us, even though he never wanted the credit and never let anyone throw him a parade. My name is Tomas Rey-Okafor. Back then, I was a junior liaison officer stationed on the Meridian platform, a big drifting spine of steel and glass floating out past the orbit of Mars. It wasn't much to look at. Long gray corridors that all looked the same, so that new arrivals got lost for their first week. Flickering lights that maintenance kept promising to fix and never did. A cafeteria that served the same 3 sad meals on a rotating loop, so that by your 3rd month you could tell what day it was by whether it was mystery stew, gray noodles, or the sandwich nobody trusted. But it was ours. Meridian was humanity's front door to the rest of the universe, the place where we met the neighbors, and I was proud to be there, even if I mostly just carried papers from one office to another and refilled water pitchers in meeting rooms. I was young. I thought carrying papers on the edge of history was the most important thing a person could do. In a way, I turned out to be right, though not for the reasons I imagined. The morning it happened, the coffee machine in the staff lounge was broken. I remember that specifically, because I stood there jabbing the button like an idiot for 2 full minutes before I finally gave up and walked away with an empty cup. Funny how the small things stick. A broken coffee machine. Out of everything that happened that day, everything enormous and impossible, that stupid broken machine is one of the details my brain decided to keep forever. It even matters to the story, though I had no way of knowing it then. I want you to sit for a second with how ordinary that morning was, before it became the least ordinary day in human history. I burned my thumb on a hot rail. I dropped a stack of folders in the corridor and had to gather them up while people stepped around me. I thought about a girl I'd met on shore leave 3 weeks before and whether she'd write back. I worried about my sister's exam results. Small human things. The last small human thoughts I would have for a very long time. 11 years old. You have to understand what things were like back then. Humanity had only been talking to other species for about 11 years. 11 years. That's nothing. That's barely long enough to learn someone's name, let alone learn how not to insult an entire civilization by accident. The galaxy, it turned out, was full, crowded, even. There were hundreds of species out there, and most of them had been flying between stars for tens of thousands of years before we even figured out how to keep a fire going overnight. To them, we were the new neighbors. The ones who just moved into the empty house at the end of the street. The ones nobody was quite sure about yet. Were we going to be quiet and keep our lawn tidy? Or were we going to play loud music and let the place fall apart? They were watching. They were always watching. First contact had happened when I was a teenager. I remember exactly where I was when the announcement came, the way older people remembered where they were for other big moments in history. A survey ship near the edge of our system had picked up a signal, and then a vessel had come, slow and cautious, and parked itself a polite distance from Earth, and waited. For 3 weeks it just waited, until we worked up the nerve to answer. The species that made contact first were called the Ils, and they were gentle, curious things, and for a while everyone thought the whole galaxy would be like them. Kind, patient, glad to have us. We were wrong about that. The Ills were kind because the Ills were careful, and they were careful because they were afraid, the way you're afraid of the deep end of a pool. Because above all of them, above every species we would come to know, sat something older and colder, something that did not do kindness or curiosity or patience. The Galactic Council. I'd never seen the Council in person before that day. Nobody I knew had. They didn't come to places like Meridian. You didn't meet the Council. The Council summoned you. You went to them if you were ever unlucky enough to be summoned, and you went on your knees, hat in hand, and you hoped they were in a good mood. In 11 years of contact, humanity had never once been summoned. We were too small to bother with. That was, honestly, the best thing you could be in the eyes of the Council. Too small to bother with. So when word came down through the channels that a full Council delegation was coming to us, out to our little rust bucket station past Mars, every person on Meridian understood the same thing at the same moment. It meant we were no longer too small to bother with. It meant we had done something. And whatever it was bad enough that the Council had decided to come see about it themselves. That kind of news travels through a station in a strange way. Nobody announced it over the speakers. It just spread, person to person, the way a chill spreads across your skin. By mid-morning everyone knew, and everyone was pretending they had important things to do while secretly doing nothing at all except waiting. Cleaning up. The station felt different that day, quieter. People spoke in low voices the way you do in a hospital or a church. The engineers had spent all night scrubbing the docking bay until the floors shone, which was pointless, because the beings who were coming had certainly seen 1,000 cleaner stations and wouldn't care about ours. But we cleaned anyway. It's what you do when you're scared. You tidy up. You make the bed. You wipe down the counters. It gives your hands something to do, while your mind runs in circles. I helped move chairs into the main conference chamber that morning, though nobody had officially told me to. I just needed to be useful. The chamber was the biggest room on Meridian, a wide circular space with a long table down the middle and a domed window on one side that looked out into open space. Usually it was used for trade meetings and dull budget reviews. That morning, someone had polished the table until you could see your own worried face in it. Our commanding officer, a stern woman named Director Ape, walked the halls with her jaw set tight, giving small orders in a low voice. Everyone respected her. She was the kind of leader who never raised her voice because she never had to. But even she looked shaken that day. I passed her in a corridor and she was standing alone by a window, just for a moment, one hand pressed flat against the glass, staring out at the empty stars where the ships would come. She didn't see me. I kept walking. Some moments aren't yours to interrupt. The medical bay was busy too, which I only understood the meaning of later. Because our actual ambassador, the man who was supposed to speak for humanity if this day ever came, was lying in that medical bay, pale and sweating, recovering from emergency surgery. His name was Ambassador Sterling, and 2 days before the Council arrived, his appendix had burst. 2 days. If it had happened 2 days later, the whole story I'm about to tell you would have gone very differently, and probably we'd all be dead. Sometimes I think about how the fate of 8 billion people turned on the timing of one man's burst appendix, and I have to sit down. But I didn't know any of that yet, standing there moving chairs. I just knew that something enormous was coming, that I was a very small part of it, that my collar was too tight, and that I couldn't get a decent cup of coffee to save my life. Then word came that I'd been assigned to the observation deck for the arrival. My heart just about stopped. The observation deck. That meant I'd actually see them come in. I'd be there, a nobody junior officer in the room. I remember Director Ape reading off the assignments from a tablet, not even looking up, and my name went by so fast I almost missed it. Rey-Okafor, observation. 4 words that changed my life. My own small fear. The ships. The observation deck was really just a fancy name for a room with big windows and not enough chairs. My job there was simple: stand still, look official, don't touch anything, don't speak unless spoken to, and probably not even then. I was young and I was sweating through my shirt before anything had even happened. There were maybe 15 of us up there. Senior analysts, a couple of security officers, some communications staff, and me, the youngest by 10 years at least. Nobody talked much. We just stood at the windows and watched the black. Then the ships came. I'll never forget the first time I saw a council vessel with my own eyes. It didn't fly in the way our ships did, all thrusters and blinking lights in the slow, careful business of docking. It just arrived. 1 second the black outside the window was empty, ordinary, the same field of distant stars I'd looked at 100 times. The next second it was filled, completely filled, edge to edge, by something the size of a city. It was pale, almost bone-colored like old ivory or a tooth. It had no visible engines, no windows, no markings, no lights, no seams that I could see. Just a smooth, curved hull that seemed to drink in the starlight around it so that the space near it looked darker than the space farther away. And it made no sound. That was the worst part. That was what made the back of my neck go cold. Something that big should make a sound. Some rumble, some hum, something you feel in your chest. It made nothing. It hung there in perfect silence, enormous and patient like a held breath. A woman next to me, a senior analyst named Dr. Farrow, whispered, "God help us." And I remember thinking, yeah, that about covers it. That's the whole prayer right there. God help us. There wasn't anything else to say. More of them arrived. Not many. 3 ships in total, each one that same silent bone white, each big enough to swallow Meridian whole and not notice. They arranged themselves around our station in a slow triangle, and once in position they simply stopped and waited and did nothing. But the doing nothing was its own kind of threat. It was the stillness of something that has all the time in the world and all the power it could ever need. They didn't have to hurry. Where would we go? I looked around the observation deck. Every face was pale. Dr. Farrow had a hand over her mouth. One of the security officers had gone completely rigid, knuckles white where he gripped the rail. And I realized, standing there, that I was looking at the faces of people who had just understood all at once that we were not in charge of our own future anymore. That maybe we never had been. The long wait before. 7 of them. The delegation came aboard through the main airlock. There were 7 of them. I'd read the briefings over the years. I knew, more or less, what the different council species were supposed to look like. But reading about something in a report and standing 30 feet away from it are 2 very different experiences. Let me try to describe them, though I already know I'm going to fall short. Some things don't fit into words. You had to be there. You had to feel the temperature of the room drop when they walked in. At the front walked the council speaker. Its species was called the Veil, and it was tall, easily 8 feet, maybe more, with a body that seemed to be built from layered dark plates like slate or shale, stacked and fitted together in a way that looked both fragile and impossibly strong. Its limbs were long and thin and bent in too many places, so that when it moved like water running downhill, smooth and wrong at the same time. Its head was narrow and had no eyes. Where a face should have been there was just a smooth curve of that same dark stone, and across it ran a single band of soft blue light. When the speaker turned toward you, that band of light shifted, and somehow, without eyes, without a face, you understood completely that it was looking at you, right through you. I don't know how to explain it better than that. You just knew in your gut the way an animal knows when it's being watched. Behind the speaker came 2 more Veil, silent, their blue lights dimmer, clearly of lower rank. Then 3 beings of a species I didn't recognize, squat and heavily built, armored in something that looked grown rather than made, with clusters of small black eyes that never stopped moving, taking in everything. Counting us, maybe. Measuring us. And then, at the very back, came the soldiers. I need to spend a moment on the soldiers because they matter later, more than anything else in this story. They weren't like our soldiers, not even a little. Our soldiers marched and sweated and had faces and got scared. These did none of that. They flowed into the room, all 6 of them, moving in such perfect unison that you truly could not tell whether they were living beings or machines wearing the shape of living beings. They wore armor the deep color of the ocean at night, and they carried long curved weapons that hummed with a light that pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat, like something breathing. Their heads were sealed inside featureless helmets, smooth and dark, with no visor, no opening, nothing. Not one of them looked left or right. Not once. They didn't need to. You got the feeling they already knew exactly where every object and every person in the room was, down to the millimeter, and that if they had to, they could end all of us before any of us finished a single breath. What the soldiers meant. I'd heard the stories about council soldiers. Everyone in the diplomatic corps had. They were whispered about the way children whisper about monsters, except these monsters were real, and you might one day meet them. They were the enforcers. The council didn't argue, and it didn't threaten twice. When a species stepped out of line, when a world refused to pay its tribute, or broke one of the 10,000 ancient laws, or grew too proud, or simply became inconvenient, the council didn't send messages back and forth. It didn't hold hearings. It sent the soldiers. And the histories, the ones the older species were willing to share with us, were full of civilizations that had lasted for millions of years, built wonders we couldn't imagine, and then one day the soldiers came, and after that there was only silence. The worlds were still there. The buildings, the cities, the monuments, all still standing, just empty, quiet, preserved as warnings for everyone else who might think about stepping out of line. That was the thing about the council. They didn't rule through love, or even really through the fear of war, because war implies 2 sides. They ruled through the absolute certainty that resistance was pointless. Nobody fought the soldiers because nobody survived fighting the soldiers. The idea of it was almost comforting to them, I think. Order, everything in its place, every species quiet and obedient and small. Standing in that observation deck and later at the edge of the conference chamber, feeling the cold that seemed to roll off their dark armor, I understood for the first time in my life that we were completely, utterly at their mercy. If the council decided that humanity should end, humanity would end. It was that simple. We had ships, sure. We had our little fleet, our weapons, our clever engineers. But putting all of that against even one of those 3 silent bone-white vessels would be like a child throwing a handful of sand at the incoming tide. The sand doesn't even slow it down. The tide doesn't even notice. And into this room, into this circle of ancient power and quiet, certain menace, walked our guy, our ambassador, the one man standing between all of humanity and the silence. Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss. Let me paint you a picture of Harlan Voss, because he is the whole heart of this story, and if you don't understand who he was, none of what he did will land the way it should. He was not impressive. I'll just say it straight out. He was of medium height, a little soft around the middle, the build a man gets from 30 years of desk work and cafeteria food. His hair was gray, and he clearly cut it himself, because it was never quite even, always a little longer on one side. He wore reading glasses on a thin chain around his neck, the kind your grandfather wears, and he was always losing them and finding them again right where he'd left them. His shirt that day was wrinkled, like he'd slept in it, which I later learned he basically had. And there was a coffee stain on his left cuff, a small brown one, old and set in, that I noticed because I ended up standing close enough to notice. He looked, in short, like a man who had been up too late and woken up too early, which, as I would come to learn, was more or less his permanent condition. He looked like somebody's kindly, slightly rumpled uncle. He looked like the last person on earth you'd pick to speak for the entire human race in its darkest hour. And here is the thing nobody knew, the thing that makes it all even more remarkable. Harlan Voss wasn't even supposed to be there. The real ambassador, Sterling, was the man they'd trained for this. Sterling was polished. Sterling had a jaw like a statue and a voice like a radio announcer and a closet full of perfect suits, and Sterling had spent 20 years preparing for the possibility, however remote, that the council might one day come. But Sterling was in the medical bay with fresh stitches in his belly and a fever, drugged half out of his mind, unable to stand, let alone negotiate for the survival of the species. So the job fell to his deputy, to Harlan, a man who had spent 30 years in the quiet corners of the diplomatic corps, translating dull trade agreements, smoothing over minor squabbles between minor officials, sitting in on meetings so boring that people fought not to be assigned to them. Harlan had never wanted the top job. He told people that openly. He liked the quiet work. He liked going home at a reasonable hour. He liked his coffee and his books and his small, predictable life. Ambition had passed him by. Or more likely, he'd politely stepped out of its way and let it go past. But there was no one else. And so, on the worst day in human history, humanity's fate rested on the shoulders of a tired, rumpled, coffee-stained man who had woken up that morning fully expecting to spend his day reviewing paperwork. The rules we lived by. What we knew about the council. The hour before the hour. He walked in slowly. Once the delegation was seated, they moved us. The observation deck emptied and a small number of us were brought down to stand along the wall of the main conference chamber as witnesses and support staff. I still don't fully know why I was chosen. I've decided over the years that it was just luck, or the kind of luck that doesn't feel like luck at the time. Somebody needed to stand by the door in case a message had to be carried, and I was the nearest body. So I ended up pressed against the back wall of the most important meeting in human history, holding an empty coffee cup I'd forgotten to put down, trying to make myself as small as possible. Harlan walked in slowly. He wasn't rushing. He nodded to the council delegation, a small polite nod, the kind you'd give a neighbor you passed on the street, and he made his way to his seat at the long table directly across from the speaker. He set down a worn leather folder, soft at the corners from years of use. He took the reading glasses from the chain around his neck and put them on, adjusting them on his nose. And then he sat, hands folded on the table, calm as a still lake at dawn. I was terrified for him. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, a fast wet thumping, and my empty cup was trembling slightly in my hands. This soft, tired, ordinary man was about to speak for all of us. For 8 billion people. For my mother back home, who was probably making dinner right that minute without the faintest idea that her son was watching the end of the world get decided. For my little sister, who was 17 and worried about her exams. For everyone I'd ever loved and everyone I'd never met. And Harlan looked, for all the world, like he was about to sit down and review someone's tax return. I couldn't understand it at the time. I thought maybe he didn't grasp what was happening. I thought maybe he was in shock or in denial or simply not clever enough to be afraid. I was wrong on all counts. Harlan understood exactly what was happening, better than any of us, I think. He just had a different relationship with fear than the rest of us did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what the speaker said. Why they came now. People ask why the council came when they did. Why that year, that month, that ordinary Tuesday. We'd been out in the dark for generations by then. Our probes had been drifting into places we shouldn't have gone for a long time. So why then? I've thought about it, and I've talked to the few people who studied the transcripts, and the best answer we have is unsettling. They didn't come because we'd finally done something bad enough. They came because we'd finally done enough of everything. We'd reached the threshold where a young species stops being noise and starts being a pattern. Where the ones who watch from a safe distance decide the pattern is either worth keeping or worth ending, and they come to make the call, and they don't wait for you to be ready, because a species is never ready to be judged. There's no good day for it. There's just the day it happens. The concord of silent spaces was real. We'd broken it. Our probes had crossed into regions that had been marked off in some language older than our sun as places the loud young ones were not to go. We hadn't known. That was the whole tragedy of it. Ignorance, the speaker said, is not innocence. And it isn't. But it isn't guilt either, not the way they meant it. We were children who'd wandered into a room we couldn't read the sign on. And the owners of the house had come to decide whether children who can't read the signs should be allowed to keep wandering. That's why the coffee mattered so much. Because in a room where we could only lose the argument on their terms, on the terms of law and precedent and 9 million years of rules we'd never had a chance to learn, Harlan changed the terms. He didn't argue the law. He couldn't. He'd have lost. Instead, he made them look at the children, not the crime, the children, and you cannot end children you've truly looked at. That's the one rule even the oldest things in the universe seem to bend to, if you can only make them look close enough. The concord of silent spaces. Speaker began, and when it spoke, its voice didn't come from its body. That was the first shock. There were no lips, no mouth, nothing to move. The voice came from the air itself, from everywhere in the room at once, translated into flat, clear, perfect English by some technology we didn't understand and never would. The voice was calm, almost gentle, almost warm, which somehow made it so much worse. A cruel voice you can brace against. A gentle voice announcing your death gets right past your guard. Humanity, the speaker said, and my whole species' name sounded so strange in that flat, translated voice. You have violated the concord of silent spaces. Nobody in the room moved. I didn't know what the concord of silent spaces was. Judging by the faces around me, none of us did. Harlan tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's listening carefully to something he doesn't yet understand but intends to. 11 of your unmanned probes, the speaker continued, have crossed into regions marked as forbidden under the oldest of our laws. These are the silent spaces. They are not to be entered. They are not to be observed. They are not to be spoken of. Your intrusion is a wound upon the order of the galaxy. It cannot be undone. It can only be answered. Harlan spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, a little rough around the edges, the voice of a man who talked more to books than to people, but it was steady. There wasn't a tremor in it. I'm not familiar with that law, he said. I'd like to understand it, if you'd be willing to walk me through it. There was a pause, a real one. I don't think the speaker was accustomed to being asked to explain itself. Species that got summoned before the council did not, as a rule, ask questions. They apologized. They begged. They did not say in a mild voice, walk me through it. The law predates your species by 9 million years, the speaker said at last. It is not a matter for explanation. It is a matter for obedience. I understand that it's old, Harlan said, unhurried. Older than we can really imagine. But here's my difficulty. You've told me the silent spaces are not to be spoken of, and I believe you. But that means no one ever told us they were there. Our probes were mapping dark, empty regions of space, the kind of regions we map all the time, looking for nothing in particular, just filling in the map. We had no way of knowing those particular regions were forbidden, because the whole point of them, as you've explained it, is that they're a secret. So I have to ask with real respect, how were we supposed to avoid entering a place we were never permitted to know existed? Ignorance is not innocence. That question hung in the air, and I want you to understand it was a good question, a fair one, a human one. There was a plain, honest logic to it that I think caught the whole delegation off guard. For one tiny, shining second, I felt a flicker of hope somewhere behind my ribs. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe reason would win. Maybe these ancient beings, wise enough to rule the galaxy for millions of years, would hear the sense in it and be reasonable. But the speaker's blue light flickered, a quick, sharp pulse, and when it spoke again, the gentleness had drained out of it. Ignorance is not innocence, it said. The wound is the same whether the hand that made it knew or did not know. A fire does not intend to burn. It burns regardless, and it must be put out regardless of its intent. The room had gone so cold and quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the ventilation in the walls, and the faint pulse of the soldiers' weapons, and, ridiculously, my own heartbeat. "The Council has reviewed your species," the speaker went on. "We have watched you for the 11 years since you first spoke, and we have read the shape of you the way one reads the shape of a seed and already knows the tree it will become. You are young. You are loud. You spread quickly like a fire across dry grass, and you do not look where you step. We have seen this pattern before many times in many species now long dead. It always ends the same way, in ruin. Not only your own ruin, which would be your own affair, but the ruin of everything and everyone unfortunate enough to be near you when you fall. The galaxy is a delicate thing. It has taken us 9 million years to make it quiet and safe and ordered. We will not permit one young and reckless species to set it burning again." Somewhere along the wall, someone began to cry. Softly, trying to hide it, a small broken sound. I couldn't turn to see who. I couldn't take my eyes off the table, off Harlan, off the terrible calm being across from him. "Therefore," the speaker said, and I felt the word land in my chest like a stone dropped into deep water, "the Council has reached its judgment. Humanity is to be ended. Your worlds will be quieted, your ships will be stilled. Your kind will be returned to the silence out of which you so briefly and so loudly emerged. Understand that this is not cruelty. We take no pleasure in it. It is order. It is even in its way a mercy. You will not suffer. There will be no war, no fire, no long dying. You will simply, all at once and painlessly cease. Quieted. I want you to imagine hearing that. I really do. I want you to stop for a second and imagine standing in a gray room floating past the orbit of Mars, holding an empty coffee cup, and hearing a calm and gentle voice from nowhere and everywhere announce that everyone you have ever loved is going to be erased. My mother humming in her kitchen, gone. My little sister and her exams that suddenly didn't matter at all, gone. My friends, the girl from shore leave who I was still hoping would write back, the old man who ran the noodle shop near my parents' apartment, the strangers on the street, the children, all of it, quieted. That was the word the speaker kept using, quieted, as if we were a noise that had simply gone on too long and someone had finally, patiently, decided to turn us off. I felt my legs go weak. I remember gripping the wall behind me. I remember thinking, in a strange flat way, so this is it. This is how it ends. Not with a war, not with a fight, but with a polite announcement in a gray room, and there is absolutely nothing any of us can do about it. 8 billion people, and their whole future was going to be decided in the next few minutes by a tired man in a wrinkled shirt. The crying along the wall got a little louder. Director Ake, standing near the head of the table, had gone the color of ash, but she held herself upright, rigid, refusing to let her legs fold. One of the squat armored delegates shifted its many eyes across the room, across all of us, and I had the sick certainty that it was simply confirming numbers, counting the noise it would soon switch off. And Harlan Voss, our tired, wrinkled, coffee-stained ambassador, the man who wasn't even supposed to be there, did something I will remember with perfect clarity until the day I die. He took off his reading glasses, slowly, unhurried. He folded them closed with a small click and let them hang from the chain against his chest. He reached up and rubbed the bridge of his nose between his thumb and finger, the way a man does when he feels a headache coming on and he's just accepting that it's going to be a long day. He let out a small breath, and then he looked up across that gleaming table at the being that had just calmly sentenced our entire species to death, and he said, "Okay, I hear you, and I can see that this is a serious conversation, a very serious conversation. It deserves my full attention, and I don't want to give it anything less than that. So before we go one step further, I'm going to need to take a short break. 5 minutes, 10 at the outside. There's a coffee machine just down the hall, and I haven't had a cup all morning, and I honestly don't think I can do this properly without one." He paused. And then, unbelievably, he glanced around the table at the delegation and added, in the mildest, most ordinary voice you have ever heard, "Does anyone else want anything? I'm buying." There is a particular kind of silence that happens when a whole room realizes it has heard something impossible. It's heavier than normal silence. It is weight. I felt it press down on all of us in that chamber the moment Harlan finished speaking. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Director Ake's mouth had come open just slightly. Dr. Farrow, standing a little ahead of me, had gone completely still, like a rabbit that spotted a hawk. And me, I remember that I actually looked down at the empty cup in my hands, then back up at Harlan, then back at the cup as if the cup might explain what I just heard. It didn't. Because here is the thing. In the entire recorded history of the Galactic Council, no species had ever responded to a death sentence by asking for a coffee break. There was no precedent. There was no protocol. Species that stood before the council wept or begged or raged or fell silent in terror, and then they were ended, and that was that. The council had done this thousands of times over millions of years. They had heard every plea. They had watched every kind of collapse, and in all that time, across all those species, not one had ever paused the proceedings to go make a hot drink. The speaker's blue light did something I hadn't seen it do before. It flickered rapidly, several times, and dimmed and brightened again. If I had to put a human word on it, and I hesitate to because they weren't human, I'd say it looked confused. The most powerful being in that room, an entity older than our entire species, appeared for just a moment to not know what to do. "You," the speaker said, and there was the smallest hitch in that flat, perfect voice, "wish to withdraw." "Not withdraw," Harlan said gently, pushing back his chair and standing up, his knees cracking a little the way an older man's do. "Just a break, a pause. I'll be right back, I promise. It's just down the hall. I truly can't think straight without coffee, and you've given me a great deal to think about, so I want to make sure I'm thinking as clearly as I possibly can when I answer you. That's out of respect for the seriousness of what you've said. You deserve my best, not my most caffeine-deprived." He gave a small, tired, entirely genuine smile. "Won't be a minute." And then, before anyone could stop him, before anyone even understood what was happening, Harlan Voss turned and walked out of the room. He actually left. I want to be very clear about what happened next, because when I tell people this part, they usually stop me and say, "Wait, he actually left. He walked out." Yes, he actually walked out. He walked right past me, close enough that I could smell that he genuinely hadn't slept, close enough to see that coffee stain on his cuff up close, and he gave me a little nod, the kind you give a stranger holding a door for you, and he went out through the chamber doors and down the corridor toward the staff lounge. The staff lounge with the broken coffee machine, which I knew was broken, which I had personally confirmed was broken not 2 hours earlier, standing there jabbing the button like a fool. Nobody followed him at first. Nobody knew what to do. The council delegation sat there, 7 ancient and terrible beings, and the 6 soldiers stood there like statues carved from deep water, and all of them were, in their own alien way, completely thrown. There was no rule for this. Their entire authority ran on the certainty that when they pronounced judgment, the condemned understood it, felt it, and submitted to it. Harlan hadn't argued. He hadn't begged. He hadn't panicked. He'd simply, politely, declined to be present for the moment and gone to get coffee. You cannot dominate a man who calmly steps out of the room. There's nothing to push against. Director Ake recovered first among us. She was, after all, our commander. She turned to a junior aide, a young man named Petrov who was even greener than me, and she said in a low, tight, controlled voice, "Go with him. Do not let him leave the station. And for the love of God, make sure he comes back." Petrov, wide-eyed, hurried out after Harlan. I watched him go and thought, better you than me, friend. The rest of us just stood there, trapped in the room with the delegation, in the most excruciating silence I have ever experienced in my life. Because you have to understand, the speaker's judgment hung over us all. Humanity is to be ended. It had said the words. And now the man who was supposed to answer for us, to plead for us, to do something, was down the hall pressing buttons on a broken coffee machine, and the rest of us were left standing under the shadow of the end of the world, not allowed to speak, not able to leave, staring at our shoes. I have never wanted to laugh and cry and be sick all at the same time so badly in my life. The machine in the lounge. I want to tell you about that coffee machine because I've had years to think about it, and I've come to believe it mattered more than anyone gave it credit for. It was an old thing, a commercial unit, the kind you'd find in a highway rest stop back on Earth, except somebody had shipped it all the way out past Mars to sit in a staff lounge on the Meridian platform. It had a cracked plastic housing and a water line that clogged if you didn't run vinegar through it every couple of months. There was a handwritten sign taped above it that said, "Please DESCALME," and under that in different handwriting, somebody had written, "I have feelings." That was the kind of place the lounge was. People wrote on things. People left half-finished crossword puzzles and arguments in the margins of the whiteboard. That machine had broken 3 days before the council arrived. Everybody knew it was broken. There was a second sign, a yellow sticky note that just said "dead" with a little frowny face. Maintenance had a work order for it somewhere in a queue behind about 40 more urgent things, because when you're running a station past Mars, a coffee machine is never the priority. There's always a seal to check, a filter to change, a reading that's half a degree off. So when Harlan Voss walked out of the most important meeting in human history and said he was going to fix the coffee machine, understand that he wasn't reaching for some grand gesture. He was reaching for the most ordinary broken thing he could find. And I think, looking back, that was exactly the point, even if he didn't plan it. He needed something small and fixable in a moment when everything large had become unfixable. He needed to put his hands on a problem he could actually solve. Petrov told me later that Harlan didn't say a word the whole time he worked on it. He just knelt down, opened the housing, found the clog and cleared it, ran the line, wiped his hands on a paper towel. Petrov said his hands were steady, not a tremor. And Petrov, who had been in 3 war zones before he ever took a station posting, said that was the most frightening thing he'd seen all day, because steady hands in a moment like that don't mean a man isn't afraid. They mean he's decided to be afraid later. What was happening down the hall? I didn't see this part directly. I got it later in pieces from Petrov, who never quite got over it, and from the corridor cameras, which recorded the whole thing, and which I have now watched more times than I can count. Harlan walked into the staff lounge. He set his worn leather folder down on the little table by the window. He went to the coffee machine, put a cup under the spout and pressed the button. Nothing happened, because of course it was broken. On the recording you can see him press it again, and again. He frowns. He tilts his head at it the same way he tilted his head at the speaker. He pulls it slightly away from the wall to look behind it. Petrov, hovering by the door, terrified, finally blurts out, "Sir, it's broken. It's been broken since this morning. There's another machine 2 levels up, but..." And Harlan says, without looking away from the machine, in the calmest voice you can imagine, "Do we have any tools? A screwdriver, maybe?" Petrov stares at him. "Sir, the council, they just said..." "I heard what they said, son." Harlan crouches down, examining the base of the machine, his old knees popping again. "Believe me, I heard every word. I'm not going anywhere near 2 levels up. That would keep them waiting far too long, and that would be rude. But I did tell them I'd get coffee, and I'm a man of my word. So, a screwdriver." And that right there is when I understood something about Harlan Voss that took me years to fully appreciate. He wasn't stalling for time, not really. He wasn't running some clever diplomatic trick, though it turned into one. He had genuinely, sincerely told those beings he was going to get a cup of coffee, and he was genuinely, sincerely going to get a cup of coffee, and a broken machine was simply a problem to be solved on the way there. The end of the world had not changed his plans. His plans were coffee. Everything else could wait its turn. Petrov found a screwdriver. Of course he did. And on the recording you can watch our ambassador, the man carrying the fate of the human race, kneel on the floor of a shabby staff lounge and calmly, methodically, Take apart a broken coffee machine while 8 billion lives hung in the balance 3 doors down. I called my mother. While Harlan was gone, in that stretch of minutes that felt like a geological age, I did something I'm not proud of and have never regretted. I stepped back from the wall, into the little alcove by the chamber door where the comms panel was, and I opened a private line and I called my mother. It was the middle of the night where she was, in the apartment in Lagos where I grew up, the one with the balcony that looked over the water. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep, and she said my name the way she always did, 3 syllables where there should be 2, stretching it out half a question. I didn't tell her what was happening. How could I? What would I even say? Mama, the sky came and it wants us gone. I just said I was thinking about her. I said I hoped she was well. I asked about the mango tree in the courtyard, the one that never fruited, and she laughed and said it was being stubborn as ever. And for about 90 seconds I stood in a room where my species was on trial for its life, and I talked to my mother about a tree. She could tell something was wrong. Mothers always can. She said, "Tomas, what is it?" And I said, "Nothing, Mama. Just a long day." And she said the thing she always said that she'd said when I left for the academy and when I shipped out and every time since. She said, "Come home safe." And I said I would try, and I meant it more than I had ever meant anything. I've thought about that call 1,000 times, about how the whole species was in that building, and every single one of us, if you'd cut us open, had somebody we wanted to call. That's what Harlan was trying to make them see, I think. Not humanity as an idea. Humanity as a room full of people who, given 3 quiet minutes, would reach for their mothers. The council waits. Back in the chamber, the waiting was becoming unbearable. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The council delegation did not speak among themselves, or if they did it in some way we couldn't perceive. The 3 squat, many-eyed beings sat perfectly still. The lesser veil sat perfectly still. Only the speaker moved at all, its blue band of light shifting slowly back and forth, and I got the strong sense that it was, for the first time in a very long time, thinking about something it did not have a ready answer for. Then the speaker spoke, and its voice filled the room. "Where has your representative gone?" It wasn't quite a question. There was an edge under the calm now, the first edge I'd heard. Director Ape stepped forward. To her enormous credit, her voice barely shook. "He has gone to get coffee," she said. "As he told you, he will return shortly. He asked for a short break, and with respect, you did not refuse him." Which was true. The speaker hadn't refused him. It had been too surprised to refuse him. And now, having not refused, it was in the strange position of having to wait, because to send the soldiers to drag a man back from a coffee machine would be, well, absurd. It would be beneath them. The council did not chase people down hallways. The council pronounced, and the universe obeyed. Except that this one small, tired man had simply stepped outside the reach of that machinery, and there was no clean way to reach back in and grab him without looking ridiculous. And beings that have ruled for 9 million years on the strength of their absolute dignity do not, it turns out, like to look ridiculous. I watched this understanding settle over the room, and I felt, for the second time, that tiny flicker of hope. It was still hopeless. Nothing had changed. Humanity was still sentenced. But something in the shape of the thing had shifted, just slightly, and for the first time the council was reacting to us instead of us reacting to them. 4 minutes. 5. Somewhere down the hall, faintly, we heard a metallic clatter, a soft curse in Harlan's voice, and then, unmistakably, the gurgle and hiss of a coffee machine coming to life. I swear to you I nearly wept. He'd fixed it, of course he'd fixed it, of course. The water-armored one's up close. I need to describe the soldiers properly, because I've heard people tell this story since, and they always get the soldiers wrong. They make them sound like monsters. They weren't monsters. That's what made them terrible. There were 6 of them, and they stood along the far wall of the chamber, 3 to a side, framing the delegation like living pillars. Their armor wasn't metal. I want to be clear about that. It looked like water that had been convinced to hold a shape. It moved. Slow currents ran through it, catching the light, so that each soldier seemed to shimmer very faintly, like the surface of a pool when someone walks past a window. When one of them shifted its weight, you could see the movement travel through the whole suit, a ripple that started at the shoulder and died out somewhere near the floor. Their weapons were the worst part, and not because they looked dangerous. They looked beautiful. Each one was a long curved shape, like a question mark drawn by someone with a very steady hand, and along the inner curve there was a light that pulsed, slow, patient, in, out, like breathing, like something alive that was very calm about the fact that it existed to end other things. You could not look at that pulse for very long. It got into your own chest. I caught myself breathing in time with it and had to look away. They never spoke. They never moved unless the speaker's light shifted in a certain way, and then all six would move at once, a single fluid adjustment, as though they weren't six soldiers but 6 fingers of one hand. I understood, watching them, that these were not brutes. These were the most disciplined beings I had ever seen. They had been standing perfectly still, perfectly ready, for what I would later learn was the better part of a human day, and not one of them had shifted a foot or scratched an itch or done any of the 1,000 small things a human body does when it's asked to stand still. That was the message, I realized, before the speaker ever said a word. The soldiers were the message. This is what patience looks like when it has had 9 million years to practice. This is what will end you, not rage, not hatred. Something that has waited longer than your entire species has existed and can wait a little longer still. The faces around the table. While we waited for Harlan to come back with his coffee, I did the only thing I could do, which was watch and try to memorize everything. Because some part of me was already certain that this was a day people would ask about for the rest of my life, and I wanted to be able to answer honestly. I watched the delegation, and I want to tell you what the waiting did to them, because it's a thing worth knowing about power. The 3 squat, many-eyed beings were the first to show it. At first they'd been perfectly still, but as the minutes stretched on, their clusters of small black eyes began to move more, flicking to the door, to the speaker, to each other, to the door again. They were not used to waiting. Nothing in 9 million years had taught them how to wait for a lesser creature. There was no muscle for it. You could see them, in their alien way, straining against the strangeness of it, the way you'd strain to use a limb you'd never known you had. The 2 lesser Veil held their stillness better, but even they had a quality of tension now, a held quality like a note played too long. And the speaker, the great speaker, sat at the head of it all with its blue light moving slowly, and I understood that it was doing something none of them had done in an unimaginably long time. It was thinking about a person, not a species, not a pattern, not a case to be judged. A specific person who had walked out of the room and might or might not come back, and whose absence had, absurdly, put the entire proceeding on hold. And I watched us too, my own people, Director Ape upright, ash-faced, refusing to fold, Dr. Farrow with her hand pressed over her mouth, the security officers' hands twitching toward weapons they knew they'd never be allowed to draw, and all of us, everyone, kept glancing at the door, willing Harlan to come back, terrified he wouldn't, terrified of what would happen when he did. It was the longest few minutes of my life. I aged years in that room. I think we all did. And underneath it all, I kept having the same insane thought over and over. He went to get coffee. The world is ending and he went to get coffee. And I couldn't tell, I genuinely could not tell, whether it was the bravest thing I had ever witnessed or the beginning of the end. It turned out to be both, in a way. It turned out those weren't as different as I'd thought. The squat delegates. I haven't said much about the other members of the delegation, the ones who weren't the speaker and weren't the soldiers, and I should, because they're the ones who changed. There were 4 of them seated at the long table. 2 were lesser Veil, smaller versions of the speaker, their plating a duller gray, the light bands at their throats a paler blue. They deferred to the speaker in everything, tilting toward it whenever it spoke, the way sunflowers tilt. I never heard them make a sound. The other two were something else entirely. Squat low to the table, their bodies covered in what I can only describe as eyes, dozens of them of every size, opening and closing in slow rotation so that the creature was always looking everywhere at once and never seemed to blink as a whole. They were unsettling in a way I couldn't shake. When you're used to faces, to a pair of eyes you can meet, a thing with 50 eyes and no face gives your instincts nothing to hold. I kept trying to find the one to look at, and there wasn't one. But here's the thing I noticed, and it took me a while because I was busy being terrified. As Harlan talked, as he fixed the coffee and came back and offered the cup and made his argument, those many-eyed delegates changed how they watched him. At first all their eyes had been scattered, roaming, taking in the whole room with that cold, uniform attention. But somewhere in the middle of it, I saw them start to focus. More and more of those eyes slowly turning toward Harlan, toward the cup, toward Ape when she stepped forward. By the end, both of them had every eye they had fixed on the two humans standing side by side, and the effect was strange and almost tender, like being looked at by a crowd that had all fallen quiet at once. I don't know what they were. I never learned their name for themselves, but I've always believed they were the ones who understood first. The speaker made the ruling, but those many-eyed things, whatever they were, they saw it before anyone. They watched a woman who didn't like a man step in front of a weapon for him, and something in all those eyes changed, and they never looked away again. What Petrov saw. Poor Petrov. I have to give the young aide his due, because he saw the part none of the rest of us saw, and it broke something open in him that never quite closed again, in a good way, I think. He told me the whole thing later, more than once, because he couldn't stop telling it. How he'd followed Harlan down the corridor, certain the man had lost his mind, certain he was about to watch our ambassador have a breakdown 3 doors from the Galactic Council. How Harlan had walked into that shabby lounge as calm as a Sunday morning. How the machine was broken, and Harlan had simply crouched down and started fixing it, knees cracking, humming faintly under his breath. Humming? That's the detail Petrov always got stuck on. Harlan was humming. Some old tune, Petrov couldn't place it. There, on the floor of a staff lounge with the fate of the species hanging over him, our ambassador was humming to himself and taking apart a coffee machine. "Sir," Petrov had said, hovering, wringing his hands, "Sir, they're waiting. The council is waiting. You can't keep the council waiting." And Harlan, not looking up, screwdriver in hand, had said, "Can't I? They've been ruling the galaxy for 9 million years, son. They've kept 10,000 species waiting for judgment. A few minutes for a cup of coffee won't kill them. And it might just do us some good." He'd loosened a panel, peered inside, made a small, satisfied noise. "There it is. Heating regulators shot. Whole thing's been trying to serve boiling water through a cracked line. No wonder it gave up." He'd glanced back at Petrov then, and his eyes, Petrov said, were kind and sad and completely clear. "Do you know why I'm doing this, really?" Petrov had shaken his head, mute. "Because I'm terrified," Harlan had said, simple as that. "I am more frightened than I have ever been. And when I'm this frightened, my hands shake and my mind races and I say stupid things. So I need a few minutes to do something small and ordinary and fixable, something I can actually solve before I go back in there and try to solve something I probably can't. This machine I can fix. That's worth something to a frightened man, understanding a small, fixable thing when everything else is too big to hold." He turned back to the machine. "Also, I really do want the coffee. Both things are true. They usually are." And then he'd fixed it and made 2 cups and squared his shoulders and gone back in to face the end of the world. Petrov never forgot it. Neither did I once he told me. A frightened man, fixing the one thing in front of him he knew how to fix. There's a whole philosophy in that if you sit with it long enough. He came back. Harlan came back into the chamber carrying 2 cups. 2, that detail mattered. On the way out he'd asked if anyone wanted anything. And now he came back with a cup for himself, steam curling off the top and a second cup in his other hand. He walked, unhurried as ever, to his seat, and he did not sit down. Instead, he came around the end of the long table, toward the council's side, toward the speaker, and I felt every soldier in the room register the movement, felt the air go tight, felt the hum of those weapons shift by some tiny degree. Director Ake made a small sound. One of the security officers took half a step forward before catching himself. Harlan stopped a respectful distance from the speaker. He held out the second cup. "I don't know if you drink coffee," he said. "I don't even know if you drink. I'm sorry, that's my ignorance, and there's been a lot of that today, hasn't there? But I offered back before I left, and it seemed rude to come back with only one. So, if you'd like it, it's yours. If you don't have a use for it, no harm done, I'll drink it myself. I'm certainly tired enough for two." He set the second cup down gently on the table in front of the speaker, in the space between them, and then he stepped back and finally took his own seat. And he took a long, slow, grateful sip from his own cup, and he closed his eyes for just a second, the way you do when the coffee is exactly what you needed. And then he opened his eyes and set down his cup and put his reading glasses back on and folded his hands and said, "All right. Thank you for waiting. I'm ready now. Where were we? You were explaining that you intend to end my species, and I was going to respond. So let me respond." Nobody in that room breathed. The little cup of coffee sat steaming on the table between the ambassador of humanity and the executioner of worlds. And I understood, finally, what Harlan had done, though I don't think he'd planned it, or maybe he had, I've never been sure. He had turned the entire encounter, without raising his voice, without a single threat, from a sentencing into a conversation. From a judgment handed down into two people at a table, one of whom had just been offered a cup of coffee by the other. You cannot easily erase someone who has just made you a coffee. It's a strange, small, deeply human truth, and I watched it work on ancient beings older than mountains. The weight of the second cup. I want to go back to the second cup, because I've thought about it more than almost anything, and I don't think most tellings of this story give it its due. When Harlan came back into that chamber carrying two cups, everyone assumed the second one was a mistake, or a nervous habit, or maybe that he'd grabbed one for Director Ake. Nobody imagined, until he walked around the table toward the speaker, that he intended to offer it to the being that had just sentenced us all to death. Think about what that offer actually was. Strip away the coffee and look at the shape of it. Harlan Voss, standing before an entity that had promised to erase his entire species, chose to treat that entity not as an enemy, not as a judge, not as a god, but as a colleague at a long meeting. Someone you'd naturally offer a coffee to because you were getting one anyway, and it would be rude not to. He refused with that single gesture to accept the roles that had been assigned. He would not be the condemned, and he would not let the speaker be simply the executioner. He reassigned both of them quietly to something smaller and warmer and infinitely more human. Two people at a table, one of whom had just made the other a drink. You cannot easily kill someone who has just offered you coffee. I said that before, but I want to say it again, because it is the strange, small, unreasonable truth at the center of this whole story, and I have watched it be true not just of alien god kings but of ordinary people ever since. There is something in the act of accepting care from another creature, or even just being offered it, that makes it very hard to then destroy them. It short-circuits something. It forces a closeness that violence needs distance to survive. Harlan understood this, I think, at some level below strategy in his bones, in the place where his good rule about fear lived. The speaker never touched the coffee. It couldn't, but it also never took its attention off it. All through the argument that followed, that little cup sat steaming and then cooling on the table between them, and it changed the whole room just by being there. It was the smallest possible gift, and it turned a sentencing into a conversation. I have given a great many gifts in my life since, expensive ones, important ones. I have never given one that did a fraction of the work that 1 cup of cooling coffee did that day. The argument. You spoke of us as a fire, Harlan began, turning his cup slowly on the table but not drinking. Loud, spreading, careless, and I won't pretend there's nothing to that. We are loud. We do spread. We've made a mess of our own home world more than once, and we're not proud of all of it. If you told me you thought we were reckless, I'd have had a hard time arguing. Maybe we are a little. Young things usually are. The speaker's light held steady, listening. But here's the thing I keep turning over, Harlan went on. You said you've watched us for 11 years, you've read the shape of us, and you decided we'll end in ruin and take others down with us because you've seen the pattern before in species now dead. And I believe you've seen it, I do. You've been alive a lot longer than we have, and you've watched a lot of species rise and fall, and I'm sure the pattern is real. He paused. But a pattern isn't a person. A pattern isn't a species. It's a story you tell about a species, from far away, watching. And the trouble with watching from far away is that you can see the shape of a thing without ever once seeing the inside of it. He picked up his coffee and took a sip, unhurried, and set it back down. You've watched us spread. Have you watched us grieve? You've watched us fight. Have you watched us forgive, which we do constantly, stupidly, against our own interests over and over? You've seen our probes cross into your forbidden dark. Did you see the person who launched them, some scientist somewhere, hoping to map a little more of the unknown before she dies, because we don't live very long and we're always racing the clock? You saw a fire. I understand why. But you were watching from very, very far away. And from that far away, everything that burns looks the same. A wildfire looks like a hearth. A bomb looks like a candle. You have to come close to tell the difference. And you never came close, until today. He gestured, gently, at the little cup of coffee still steaming in front of the speaker. That's all this is, he said. Me, asking you to come a little closer before you decide. That's the whole of my argument. Not that we're innocent. Not that we've done nothing wrong. Just that you're about to erase something you've only ever seen from a distance, and I think a thing as old and as wise as you are ought to at least look at what it's ending up close before it ends it. That seems like the difference between an execution and just, well, tidying up. And I don't believe you're a species that merely tidies up. 9 million years of order isn't tidiness, it's care. Terrible cold, but care. So I'm asking the part of you that cares to look, just look, before you decide. Ape before. Director Ape was not a warm woman. I want to be honest about her, because the stories since have made her into a kind of saint, and she would have hated that. She'd have looked at you with that flat expression she had and told you to get back to work. She ran the Meridian platform the way you'd run a machine you didn't entirely trust. Everything checked twice, every reading logged. She knew every one of the 400 souls on that station by name, and she knew which ones were reliable and which ones needed watching, and she never let on which was which meant everybody worked a little harder just in case. She'd come up through the mining stations, the real ones, the ones where a mistake didn't get you a bad review, it got you dead, and the person next to you dead too. She carried that with her. She had a way of looking at a problem that assumed it was already trying to kill her. She and Harlan did not get along. That's a thing people don't know. She thought he was soft. He thought she was rigid. They'd had words more than once in the months before about how the station should be run, about protocol, about a dozen small things. There was no love lost between them. If you'd asked me, the day before the council came, whether Ake would step in front of a weapon to save Harlan Voss, I'd have laughed. I'd have said she'd more likely hand him the bill for the cleanup. So when she stepped forward, when she put her own body between that pulsing weapon and Harlan's back, it wasn't friendship that moved her. It wasn't even respect exactly. It was something older and harder than either. It was the thing she'd learned in the mines, the thing you cannot fake and cannot teach in any academy. You do not let the fire take one of yours while you stand and watch. It doesn't matter if you like them. It doesn't matter if you'd fire them tomorrow. In the moment the fire comes, they are yours and you stand between. I think that's why it landed the way it did. If it had been Harlan's friend who stepped forward, the council might have called it loyalty and dismissed it. But it was a woman who didn't even like him, and that's harder to explain away. That's not loyalty. That's something built into the frame. The soldiers shift. Now I have to tell you about the soldiers again, because this is where it all nearly came apart. While Harlan spoke, one of the 6 council soldiers moved. It was a small thing. If you weren't watching them the way I was, pressed against the wall with nothing else to do but watch and be terrified, you might have missed it. But one of the soldiers turned its featureless dark head, just slightly, and its curved weapon shifted in its grip, the pulsing light along its length quickening from a slow heartbeat to something faster, more awake. And I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, that it had decided Harlan had come too close to the speaker. That the ambassador, standing near the most senior being in the galaxy, gesturing at it, addressing it not as a supplicant but as an equal, had crossed some line that the soldiers existed to enforce. The weapon began to rise. I have thought about the next 4 seconds more than any 4 seconds of my life. Here is what happened. Director Ape saw it too. And she did something extraordinary, something I don't think she planned any more than Harlan had planned the coffee. She stepped forward, away from the wall, out into the open floor of the chamber, directly into the space between the rising weapon and Harlan Voss. She put her body there, a human woman, unarmed, in a pressed uniform, standing between an alien weapon and our ambassador, with nothing to protect her but the plain fact of her own body and her refusal to move. "He is speaking," she said. Her voice did not shake now. It had gone hard and clear and absolutely steady, the voice of a woman who had decided something and was at peace with it. "He was granted the floor. He offered your speaker coffee and your speaker did not refuse it. He has raised his voice to no one. He has made no threat. He is an old man with a cup of coffee, saying please. If your discipline means anything, if your order means anything, then it means you do not cut down an unarmed man in the middle of a sentence for the crime of asking you to look before you kill. So lower your weapon, or fire it through me first." And she stood there. She did not blink, she did not move. 6 ancient soldiers, and 1 human woman, and the whole future of our species balanced on the edge of a curved and glowing blade. The longest second. Nobody moved. The weapon hovered. The light along it pulsed, fast now, hungry. I could see Harlan behind Director Ape, and to his eternal credit, he did not flinch, did not step back, did not use her body as cover. He simply set down his coffee cup quietly and stood, and put a hand on her shoulder, not pulling her back, just resting it there, so that if it came, it would come for both of them together. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I still had the empty cup in my hands, and that I should put it down, that it seemed disrespectful to die holding an empty cup. I remember Dr. Farrow beside me had stopped breathing entirely. I remember the light, that awful pulsing light climbing along the length of the weapon. And then the speaker spoke a single word, not in English, in its own tongue, sharp and low, a sound like 2 stones grinding together, and the soldier froze. The weapon stopped rising, the light along it slowed further. And then, with the same unhurried perfection it did everything, the soldier lowered the weapon, and the pulse of it dropped back down to that slow, sleeping heartbeat, and it returned to its statue stillness as if nothing had happened at all. The speaker's blue band of light turned, slowly, toward Director Ape, who still had not moved from the space between the weapon and Harlan. "You stepped in front of death," the speaker said, "for a man not of your family, not of your blood, for a species you will not personally save, since you would have died before the judgment is carried out either way. Explain this." And Director Ape, still standing tall, still not stepping back, said the truest thing anyone said in that room all day. "There's nothing to explain. He's mine, not my blood. Mine, my people, that's all the reason there is. That's all the reason there's ever been." She let out a slow breath. "You wanted to come close and see what we are before you end us. This is what we are. We step in front of each other, that's it. That's the whole species right there in one move. Now you've seen it up close. Now you decide. The coffee goes cold. The speaker was silent for a long time after that. The little cup of coffee it had never touched sat on the table between them, and I watched the steam thin and fade and finally stop, the coffee going cold, untouched, a small human gift that had done its quiet work simply by being offered. Harlan gently guided Director Ake back a step, and the two of them stood together now, side by side, facing the delegation. He picked up his own cup again. It had gone lukewarm. He drank it anyway. He did not waste it. "I'd like to add one thing," Harlan said, "and then I'll be quiet and let you decide, and whatever you decide, we'll face it the way she just showed you, standing up together." He nodded at Ake. "You said we'll end in ruin and take others with us. Maybe. I can't promise you we won't. Nobody can promise that about anybody. But I'll tell you what I saw just now, and you saw it too because you were watching close for the first time. When the weapon came up, not one person in this room ran. Did you notice that? There's a door right there. Not one of my people ran for it. She stepped forward. And he gestured at me, at all of us against the wall. They stayed. That's not the behavior of a species that ends in ruin. A species that ends in ruin scatters when the fire comes. Mine steps toward it to stand between the fire and each other. I don't know what you call that in your language. In ours, the closest word is love, though it's a bigger thing than that word usually carries. And I have never once in all our loud and reckless history seen it lead to ruin. I've seen it lead to a great many foolish, beautiful, impossible things, but never ruin. Ruin comes from the opposite, from nobody stepping forward, from everybody watching from a safe distance." He let that sit. Then he added, so quietly I almost didn't hear it from the wall, "You've been watching from a safe distance for 9 million years. I wonder if you remember how to step forward. I hope you do. I'd hate for the last thing we ever taught the galaxy to be something it forgot a long time ago." And then Harlan Voss sat back down and finished his cold coffee and folded his hands and waited, like a man who had said his piece and made his peace, for the ancient powers of the universe to decide whether his species would see another sunrise. I don't know how long the council took to decide. It felt like hours. It was probably minutes. When you're waiting to learn whether your entire species gets to keep existing, time stops meaning very much. The 7 of them did not confer out loud. They sat, and the room sat with them, and the cold cup of coffee sat on the table, and Harlan sat with his own empty cup, and Director Ake stood beside him because she had decided she was not going to sit down again until this was over, and the rest of us pressed ourselves against the wall and tried to remember how to breathe. I studied the speaker's blue light the whole time. I had learned over the last hour to read it a little. When it was certain, the band was steady and even. When Harlan surprised it, the light flickered, and now in the deciding it did something new. It moved slowly back and forth, dimming and brightening, and I understood that I was watching, in whatever way its kind could, a mind actually changing, or trying to, or fighting itself. 9 million years of one answer, and now, for the first time in longer than humanity had existed, a reason to consider a different one. The 3 many-eyed beings turned their clusters of black eyes toward the speaker, then toward each other, then back to Harlan. The 2 lesser Veil sat utterly still, and the soldiers, those 6 statues of dark water, stood exactly as they had before, weapons at rest, giving nothing away. Then the speaker spoke, and I felt the whole room brace as one body. "We have decided," it said. Harlan set down his cup. Director Ake's hand found the back of his chair and gripped it. I stopped breathing entirely. And somewhere, hundreds of millions of kilometers away, my mother stirred a pot on the stove without any idea that her whole future was being spoken aloud in a gray room past Mars. "The verdict. The judgment of ending is suspended," the speaker said. Suspended, not lifted, not canceled. Suspended. But in that moment, that single word was the most beautiful word I had ever heard in any language, and I heard someone along the wall let out a sob that was equal parts terror and relief, and I realized a second later that it had come from me. "Understand what this is and what it is not," the speaker continued, and the room went still again to listen. "It is not forgiveness. You crossed into the silent spaces. That wound remains, and you will help us tend it in ways we will explain. Over years you will find long and we will find brief. It is not trust. Trust is not given to the young. It is earned across a length of time your species cannot yet imagine, and most species never earn it at all. And it is not safety. Should you become, in truth, the fire we feared, this judgment will be taken up again where it was set down, and there will be no coffee and no waiting and no cup offered across the table. Do not mistake mercy for weakness. We are not weak. We have simply chosen, for the first time in a very long time, to come close before we decide, as your representative asked." The blue light turned toward Harlan. "You did a thing today that no species has done in the whole span of our record," the speaker said. "You did not beg. You did not threaten. You did not accept. You made us wait over something small and warm, and in the waiting you made yourself and your kind into something we had to look at, rather than something we could merely end. We have watched 10,000 species meet this room. You are the first to change what happens in it. We do not fully understand how you did this. We are not certain you understand it either, but it has been noted, it will be remembered, and it has bought your species not safety but the thing that comes before safety and makes it possible. Time. You have bought yourselves time." Harlan stood slowly, his knees cracking one last time, and he inclined his head, that same small polite nod he'd given when he walked in, a lifetime ago, an hour ago. "That's all I ever wanted," he said quietly. "Just a little more time. It's all any of us ever really want. Thank you for the coffee break. And I swear on everything." The speaker's blue light did something then that looked, for just a flicker, almost like the alien ghost of a smile. The cup. Before the delegation left, one more small thing happened, and it's the thing I think about most, even more than the verdict itself. The speaker rose from the table, unfolding to its full impossible height, and the delegation rose with it. But before it turned to go, it reached out one long, thin, many-jointed limb, and it picked up the cup of coffee. The one Harlan had offered it. The one that had gone stone cold, untouched, an hour before. It held the cup for a moment. It did not drink it. I don't think it could. But it held it and turned it slightly, the way Harlan had turned his own cup while he talked, and something passed between the two of them that I have never had words for. "We do not drink," the speaker said, "but we keep. We keep things that mark a change. In 9 million years we have kept very few, a stone from a world that taught us patience, a song from a species that taught us grief, and now this." It closed its long fingers around the cup. "The first cup of coffee, from the first species that made us wait. We will keep it, humanity. Long after you have grown up or grown wise, or, if we are wrong about you after all, long after you have ended. We will keep it, and we will remember that once, a small tired creature stood in this room with the whole weight of its kind on its shoulders, and instead of begging, it offered us something warm, and asked us only to look before we chose. And then the Council of the Galaxy, the enforcers of 9 million years of silence and order, filed out of our shabby gray conference room carrying a paper cup of cold coffee like it was a holy relic, and their bone-white ships peeled away from around our station one by one, silent as ever, and the black outside the window was just the black again, ordinary, full of distant, uncaring stars. We stood there, all of us, for a long time, and nobody said a word, because there were no words yet invented that fit. The sound of the ships leaving. When the council left, they didn't leave the way they came. When they arrived, there had been nothing, no warning, no engines. One moment the space past the Meridian platform was empty and the next it was full of them, those vast dark shapes just there, as though they had always been there and we had only just remembered to see them. That was part of the fear. Things that powerful don't need to announce themselves. They simply are, and then you are looking at them, and it's already too late to do anything about it. But when they left, I was watching through the long observation window on the third ring, the one that looked out on the dark, and I saw it happen, and I will never forget it as long as I live. The ships didn't fire engines. They didn't turn. They simply began to be less there. That's the only way I can say it. The dark came back into them slowly, the way color leaves a face, until the shapes were suggestions, and then rumors, and then the honest empty black of space with the honest stars behind it. And there was a sound. This is the part nobody believes, but every person who was near a hull that day heard it, and we've talked about it since, and we all heard the same thing. A low tone, felt more than heard, coming up through the deck plates and into the bones of your feet. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. It was not a threat and it was not music exactly, but it was closer to music than to anything else, and it was the saddest sound I have ever encountered. Petrov said it sounded like a door closing very gently in a house where someone has just died. I've never found better words than his. I think it was the sound of something ancient deciding, for now, not to do a thing it had decided to do 1,000 times before to 1,000 other young and noisy species. I think it was the sound of a held breath let out. I don't know. I only know that 400 people stood very still while it lasted, and when it stopped and the dark was just the dark again, a lot of us were crying, and none of us could have told you exactly why. The hours after are a blur to me now. I remember Petrov, the young aide, coming back into the chamber and just standing in the doorway with the screwdriver still in his hand, staring, having missed the entire ending because he'd been guarding a coffee machine. I remember Dr. Farrow sitting straight down on the floor, right where she'd been standing, her back against the wall, and laughing, a high shaky laugh that turned into crying and then back into laughing. I remember Director Ake walking, very calmly, out of the chamber and around a corner and being quietly, thoroughly sick, and then straightening her uniform and coming back as if nothing had happened, because she was the commander and the commander does not fall apart where her people can see. And I remember Harlan. He didn't celebrate, he didn't make a speech. He didn't seem to understand, even then, that he had just done the single most important thing any human being had ever done. He gathered up his worn leather folder, and he tucked his reading glasses back into his shirt pocket, and he looked around the room at all of us, at our tear-streaked, disbelieving faces, and he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. "Well," he said, "I think that went about as well as it could have." He paused, then added, "I should probably send someone to look at that coffee machine properly. My fix won't hold. I bypassed the heating regulator, which is why it took so long, and it'll fail again within the week." He frowned, genuinely troubled by this. Somebody should really put in a proper requisition. And then he walked out to go, I later learned, and sit alone in his quarters, and shake, and finally, in private, let himself feel every ounce of the terror he had swallowed down and kept off his face for the entire hour that he held the fate of our species in his hands. Petrov found him an hour later, still shaking, still pale, and Harlan looked up at him and said in a small voice, "Was that real? Did that actually happen? I keep thinking I dreamed it." And Petrov said, "Yes, sir, it was real. You saved us all." And Harlan Voss put his face in his hands and wept, not from sadness, but from the sheer unbearable weight of what he had carried and finally been allowed to set down. Harlan's hands. I found Harlan alone about an hour after the ships left. Everyone was looking for him. There were calls coming in from Earth, from Mars, from every station in the system, all of them wanting the man who had saved the species. And the man who had saved the species had gone and hidden in the staff lounge, sitting at the little table by the fixed coffee machine, holding a fresh cup he wasn't drinking. I almost didn't go in. It felt like intruding on something. But he saw me in the doorway and he tipped his head at the chair across from him, so I sat. And I saw his hands. This is what I came in to tell you about out of everything. His hands were shaking. Now, finally, Not when the weapon came up. Not when he offered the cup to a thing that could have unmade our whole world with a shift of its light. His hands had been steady through all of that. But now, in the quiet, with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, they were shaking so badly the coffee trembled in the cup and slopped over the rim onto his fingers, and he didn't even seem to notice. I said, "Sir, are you all right?" And he looked at me and he laughed, this small broken laugh, and he said, "No, God, no, I don't think I'll be all right for a while." He set the cup down so it would stop spilling. He looked at his own shaking hands like they belonged to someone else. He said, "You want to know the truth, Tomas? I don't remember deciding to do any of it. People are going to ask me why I asked for the coffee break, and I'm going to have to make up some wise reason, because the real reason is I don't have one." My mouth just said it. I think I was so scared my body decided the meeting was over whether the rest of me agreed or not. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. So I just sat with him while his hands shook, and after a while they stopped, and he picked the cup back up and drank the coffee, cold now, and made a face, and said it was terrible and that the machine still needed descaling. And somehow that was the moment I stopped being afraid. Not when we were saved. Now, watching a terrified man drink bad coffee and complain about it. That's when I knew we were going to be all right. The night we couldn't sleep. Nobody slept on the Meridian platform the night after the council left. 400 people, and I'd bet not one of us got an hour. You'd think we'd have collapsed. We'd been awake through the most exhausting day a person could live through. We'd been sentenced to death and then reprieved, all in the space of an afternoon. Our bodies should have shut down out of pure mercy. But that's not how it works, I learned that night. When you've stared at the end of everything and then been handed everything back, your body doesn't want sleep. It wants to be awake. It wants to feel the awake, every second of it, because it just found out how close it came to never feeling anything again. So we wandered. That's my clearest memory of the aftermath, not the ceremonies later, not the medals, but that first sleepless night. 400 people drifting through the station, unable to be alone and unable to say much. The mess hall filled up around midnight and stayed full till dawn, not because anyone was hungry, but because it was warm and bright and full of other faces. Somebody made coffee. Of course somebody made coffee. The fixed machine ran all night, and nobody complained that it needed descaling, and I think we drank it partly as a kind of communion, though nobody would have used that word. People told each other where they'd been standing, what they'd seen, what they'd thought in the moment the weapon came up. There was a woman from hydroponics who'd never spoken to me in 2 years of sharing a station, and that night she sat down across from me and told me, in a low, steady voice, about her children back on Mars, and how she'd made her peace in that room with never seeing them again, and how she didn't know yet what to do with the fact that now she would. She was calm about it. We were all calm about it, in that strange, hollowed-out way. The terror was over and the joy hadn't arrived yet, and in between there was just this vast, quiet honesty. People telling each other true things because we'd all just remembered at the same time that there might not be a later to tell them in. I've been to a lot of celebrations since. Real ones, loud ones, with music and speeches. None of them ever came close to that silent, sleepless night in the mess hall, 400 survivors drinking bad coffee, telling each other the truth, watching the window for a dawn we genuinely not expected to see. That was the real celebration. It just didn't look like one. The best ones never do. The first message home. Somebody had to tell Earth. That was the strange, staggering thing that hit us in the quiet after the ships left. The council had come and judged us and been turned aside, and almost nobody in the entire human race knew that any of it had happened. 8 billion people had gone about their ordinary day, gotten up, gone to work, made dinner, put their children to bed, argued about small things, none of them aware that their entire existence had hung by a thread over a cold cup of coffee. Director Ake made the call to send word up the chain immediately, but carefully in stages, because you cannot simply announce to a species that it was nearly exterminated that afternoon and then say, "But don't worry, it's fine now." That kind of news, delivered wrong, breaks people. So it went up quietly at first, to the people who needed to know, the leaders and the councils and the ones who'd have to decide how much of it the public could bear. But I remember the very first message that went out, because I was in the communications room when it was composed, still holding, God help me, that same empty coffee cup. Director Ape stood over the comms officer's shoulder, and she was silent for a long moment trying to find the words for the unspeakable. And in the end, what she sent was short. It said, roughly, "Contact with Galactic Council concluded. Existential threat presented and against all expectation, averted through diplomacy. No casualties. Full report to follow." And then at the bottom she added a line that wasn't standard, that wasn't protocol, that she just wanted on the record. She added, "Humanity endures. Tell them we stood up." Tell them we stood up. I have never forgotten that line, because we had. That's exactly what we'd done. We'd stood up. Director Ape had literally stood up between a weapon and a man. Harlan had stood up out of his chair to go and be kind. And the rest of us, the ones who couldn't do anything but witness, we'd stood there and not run, and it turned out that not running was its own quiet kind of standing up. I called my mother again that night. I wasn't supposed to, I did anyway. I couldn't tell her anything still. But I needed to hear her voice one more time now on the far side of it, now that I knew we'd get to keep having ordinary days. She answered half asleep, surprised, and she said, "Tomas, twice in one day. What on earth is going on with you?" And I laughed and my eyes stung and I said, "Nothing, Mom. Nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. I just wanted to hear your voice." And she was quiet a second and then she said softly, in the voice mothers have, "All right, sweetheart. I'm here. I'm always here. Go to sleep." And I did, eventually. For the first time in my life truly understanding what a gift an ordinary tomorrow is. What my father said. My father was a quiet man who had spent his life fixing engines on cargo haulers, and he was not given to big statements. So when he called me a week after it all happened, I paid attention. He'd seen the broadcasts. Everyone had by then. The story had gone everywhere. The ambassador and the coffee break. They were already making it smaller and shinier than it had been, turning it into the kind of thing you could put on a poster. My father had watched all of it and he called me, and he didn't ask if I was safe, because he could see that I was. He asked me something else. He said, "The man who fixed the coffee machine. Tell me about him, not the story, him." So I told him. I told him about the shaking hands, about the bad laugh, about how Harlan didn't remember deciding anything, how his mouth just said it. I told him the unshiny version, the real one. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I've carried ever since. He said, "That's the only kind of brave that's real, you know, the kind you don't decide, the kind that just comes up out of you when there's no time to be a coward. Everybody thinks brave men aren't scared. I've known a few brave men. They were all scared to death. The difference is what the fear does. Some men, the fear makes them run. A few men, God knows why, the fear makes them reach for the person next to them instead. Nobody knows which kind they are until the day it's asked of them, not even them." Then he said, "Your ambassador reached for the person next to him, in front of the whole sky. That's a good man to have learned under, son. Learn it well." And then, because he was who he was, he asked if I was eating properly and told me my mother worried, and we talked about ordinary things and hung up. But I wrote down what he said as soon as we did. I've still got it. It's in my hand on the back of an old station requisition form, and I've read it more times than I could count. The debrief. There was a debrief, of course. You can't have something like that happen and not pick it apart afterward. For days, then weeks, then months, the analysts and the strategists and the experts went over every second of it, every word, every gesture, trying to understand exactly what had worked and why, so that we could do it again if we ever had to. They watched the corridor footage of Harlan fixing the coffee machine 1,000 times. They analyzed the timing of the break, the choice of the second cup, the exact wording of his argument, the psychology of the offer. Whole theories were built. Some said it was a deliberate power play, that by making the council wait, Harlan had subtly asserted humanity's refusal to be dominated. Some said it was about the coffee itself, the universal significance of shared hospitality, some deep signal that crosses all species boundaries. Some said it was pure luck, that the council had been on the verge of mercy anyway and Harlan just happened to be in the chair when it landed. They asked Harlan to explain his thinking over and over in meeting after meeting, and he grew visibly tired of it. Because his answer was always the same, and it was always too simple for them to accept. "I wasn't playing a game," he'd say. "I keep telling you all this and none of you believe me. I was frightened and I wanted coffee and I offered them some because that's what you do. There was no plan. There was a scared man and a good habit." He'd rub the bridge of his nose in that way he had. "The only deliberate thing I did, the only real decision was this. When they told us they were going to end us, I decided in that moment that I was not going to spend what might be the last hour of my species groveling. I decided we would meet the end if it came as ourselves, standing up, being decent, offering coffee. Because if we were really going to die, I wanted the last thing we ever did to be something I was proud of, something that was truly us, and not something small and frightened and crawling. That's it. That's the only strategy there was. I decided to die well if I had to die, and it turned out that dying well and living looked in that one moment exactly the same. Nobody wrote that in the official report. It wasn't tactical enough. It didn't give them a method they could repeat. But it's the truest thing anyone said in all those months of analysis, and I've carried it with me ever since. Sometimes the way you survive a thing is by being fully prepared not to, and meeting it as your best self and letting that be enough, whatever comes." What they made of him. Of course, the story got out. A thing like that can't stay quiet. Within a week, the whole of humanity knew that the Galactic Council had come to end us, and that a rumpled deputy ambassador had asked for a coffee break, and somehow, impossibly, saved the species. They wanted to make him a hero. They wanted parades, statues, medals, his face on things. There was talk of a monument. There was talk of renaming the station after him. Politicians wanted to stand next to him for photographs. Whole books were being written about the coffee, the meaning of the coffee, the strategy of the coffee, entire scholarly theories about the psychological genius of offering a hot beverage to a superior alien intelligence. Harlan hated all of it, truly hated it. He gave exactly one interview, and when they asked him about his brilliant strategy, his masterstroke, his psychological gambit, he looked genuinely baffled and said, "Strategy. I wasn't being strategic. I was tired and I wanted coffee and it seemed rude not to offer them some. That's the whole of it. I think everyone's reading a great deal into a very simple thing." The interviewer pushed, certain there was more, certain no one could be that calm by accident. And Harlan said the thing that, for me, unlocks the whole man. "Look," he said, "when they said they were going to end us, I was as scared as anyone. More maybe because I was the one who had to answer, and I knew I wasn't the right person. I knew Sterling should have been in that chair, not me. And when you're that scared, that far past scared, you reach for the most ordinary thing you can find. The most human, normal, small thing. For me, that was coffee. I wasn't trying to outwit an ancient galactic empire. I was a frightened man reaching for something familiar to steady himself. The coffee was for me. That it also happened to remind them we were people and not a fire, well," he shrugged. "Sometimes the thing that steadies you is the same thing that saves you. I didn't plan that. I just needed a cup of coffee, and I didn't see why the end of the world should stop me from being polite about it." That was Harlan. He went right on being a deputy for another few years, right on translating dull trade agreements, right on going home at a reasonable hour, right on quietly declining every promotion and medal and honor they tried to press on him. He said the work suited him. He said heroes made terrible clerks and he'd rather be a good clerk. I don't think a single person who tried to give him a medal ever understood him, but I did. By then, I did. The ones who didn't believe. Not everyone thanked Harlan. I should tell that part too, because it's true, and because leaving it out would make this too clean, and Harlan hated things that were too clean. There were people, powerful people, who were furious with him. Furious that a mere deputy had, without authorization, without consultation, without any mandate at all, gambled the entire species on a coffee break. What if it had failed? What if the soldier's weapon had come down? What if his little display of ordinary humanity had struck the council as insolence rather than dignity, and they'd ended us on the spot, angrier than before? He'd rolled the dice with 8 billion lives, they said, on instinct, on a whim, on a coffee habit, and just because he'd won didn't mean he'd been right to play. And you know what? They weren't entirely wrong, that's the hard part. Harlan himself admitted it. He said more than once, "They're right that it could have gone another way. I got lucky." Anyone who tells you I knew it would work is lying and probably wasn't there. I didn't know. I hoped. There's a difference, and it's a big one, and people who bet everything on a hope had better be humble about it afterward, because the graveyard of history is full of people who hoped and were wrong. I just happened to be one of the ones who hoped and wasn't. That's not wisdom. That's fortune. Don't build a religion out of my good luck. He never let anyone turn him into a legend without immediately puncturing it. When they called him brave, he said he was scared. When they called him brilliant, he said he was tired. When they called him a savior, he got genuinely upset and said the savior nonsense was dangerous because it let everyone else off the hook. I didn't save us alone, he'd insist. Ape stepped in front of a weapon. That's the moment it actually turned, not my coffee, her body. And every person in that room who didn't run, they saved us too, because the council was watching all of them, not just me. If any one of you had bolted for the door, it might have confirmed everything they believed about us. You all stayed. You all stood up. Stop putting it all on me. I can't carry it and I don't want to. That was Harlan, arguing against his own myth right up to the end. And I think that stubbornness, that refusal to be made into more than a frightened, decent man who got lucky, is exactly the thing that made him able to do what he did. A man who needed to be a hero could never have offered that coffee. Only a man content to be ordinary could. There's a lesson buried in there that I'm still turning over, all these years later. The cup in the museum. Years later, they built a museum. Of course they did. Humans build museums the way birds build nests, without quite being able to help it, out of a need to keep the important things somewhere we can go and stand near them. The centerpiece was supposed to be the cup, not the one the speaker took that was gone off in the dark somewhere in the keeping of a power that had decided we could live. The other one, Harlan's cup, the one he drank from cold. Somebody had saved it. Ape, actually, though she never admitted it. She'd wrapped it in a cloth and locked it in her desk that same day, the practical woman, thinking of history even while her hands were probably still shaking too. When the museum was built, she gave it to them, and they put it in a case in the center of a great quiet room, on a little stand, under a soft light. I went to see it once when I was an old man myself. I stood in front of the case for a long time. It's an ugly cup. That's the thing nobody tells you. It's a cheap white ceramic mug with a chip on the handle and a faint brown ring stained into the bottom that no washing ever got out. It is the least remarkable object you could imagine. Children walk past it and are disappointed. They expect something that glows. But I stood there, an old man who had been a frightened boy against a wall in that room, and I looked at that ugly chipped cup, and I understood that it was exactly right. That was the whole point. We weren't saved by something that glowed. We were saved by the most ordinary thing in the room, by a broken machine and a bad cup of coffee and a scared man who offered it to the thing that came to kill us, not as a trick, not as a strategy, but because that is simply what you do. Someone comes into your house, even a terrible someone, even at the worst possible hour, and some old instinct older than fear says, "I should offer them something to drink." That instinct saved us. That's what's in the case. Not a cup. An instinct kept behind glass so we don't forget we have it. The years after. The suspension held. It's still holding, all these years later. Humanity is, as I write this, still here, still loud, still spreading, still making a mess of things and stepping in front of each other and being foolish and beautiful and alive. The council kept its word in all the ways it said it would. It was not forgiveness, and it was not trust, and it was not safety. There were years of hard, humbling work, of tending the wound we'd made in the silent spaces, of learning laws so old their origins were lost even to the veil of being watched, always watched, but now watched from close instead of from far away. That was the difference Harlan bought us. Not that they stopped watching, that they came near enough to see us properly. And it turned out that up close we were harder to end. Up close we had faces, up close we made coffee. I rose through the ranks over the years. I'm not a junior liaison anymore, carrying papers and refilling pitchers. I have a title now and an office and people who carry papers for me, and I try to be kind to them the way, in the end, that day taught me to be. Because here is the lesson I took from it, the one I've carried longest. The council was the most powerful force in the galaxy, and it ruled through certainty and terror and distance. And it was undone, or at least turned aside, not by a greater power, because there was no greater power, but by a tired man who refused to be terrified into forgetting his own small humanity. Who, standing at the very end of everything, was still capable of thinking, I could use a coffee and would anyone else like one? That's not weakness. I used to think it might be. I know now it's the opposite. It takes more strength to stay ordinary and kind under that kind of weight than it does to rage or beg or break. Harlan stayed himself. That was the whole trick, if it was a trick at all. He stayed exactly, stubbornly, gently himself, and he made the galaxy come close enough to see it. Teaching my daughter. I have a daughter now. Had, I should say, though she's grown and gone off to a station of her own, further out than Meridian ever was, doing work I only half understand. But I raised her, and when she was small, I told her this story. The way you tell a child the stories that matter, over and over until they're bored of it, and then a few times more. She loved the coffee machine part best when she was little. She thought it was funny, a man fixing a coffee machine while aliens waited. She'd laugh every time. Kids know something we forget. They know it is funny. It should be funny. The most important moment in the history of our species and a man's main concern is descaling a coffee maker. That's a joke the universe told, and it's a good one, and my daughter got it before she was 5. But when she was older, 13 or so, she came to me one evening, serious the way 13-year-olds get, and she said she'd been thinking about the story and she didn't think it was about the coffee at all. And I asked her what she thought it was about. And my daughter, who was 13, said, "It's about how they came to see if we were worth keeping, and the answer was, we're worth keeping because we'd rather share than win." He didn't try to beat them. He tried to give them coffee. That's the answer, isn't it? That's the thing about us that made them stop. I had to leave the room. I told her I needed water. I didn't need water. I needed a minute, because my 13-year-old had said in one breath the thing I'd spent 40 years trying to put into words, and she'd said it better than I ever had. That's the whole thing. We're worth keeping because we'd rather share than win. I don't know if she remembers saying it. I've never told her what it did to me. But I've thought more than once that if the council ever comes back, if they ever want to check whether they made the right call, they wouldn't need to talk to an ambassador. They could just talk to a 13-year-old who worked it out on her own. They'd get their answer. They'd see it was still true. The last time I saw him, Harlan Voss died a few years ago. Old age in his sleep at home on Earth, which is how he wanted it. Not on a station, not in a headline, not with the galaxy watching. Just an old man in his own bed, having lived out the rest of his quiet life more or less exactly as he'd always wanted to, which was quietly. I went to see him near the end. He was frail by then, small in the bed, that unruly self-cut hair gone thin and white. But his eyes were the same, and his voice when he spoke was the same steady, slightly rough voice that had once talked an empire out of ending the world. We didn't talk about the council much. We never really did over the years. He didn't like to. But near the end I couldn't help it. I asked him. I said, "Harlan, weren't you afraid, in that room? Weren't you certain we were all going to die?" And he was quiet for a while, looking at the ceiling. Then he said, "Of course I was. I was more afraid than I've ever been in my life. I was so afraid I could barely feel my own hands." He turned his head on the pillow and looked at me. "But here's a thing I learned a long time before that day, Tomas, back when I was young and nobody, doing small work nobody wanted. Fear is loud, but it's stupid. It only knows one word, and the word is run. And most of the time, running is exactly the wrong thing to do. So I made a rule for myself, years and years before the council ever came. When I'm most afraid, I do the smallest, most ordinary, most human thing I can find. Because fear can't survive contact with the ordinary. You can't be terrified and make coffee at the same time. Try it sometime. The coffee wins. It always wins." He smiled then, that same tired, gentle smile. The galaxy thought I was brave or clever. I was neither. I just had a good rule and a bad coffee habit, and I got lucky that the two lined up on the right day. He closed his eyes. "Do me a favor, Tomas. When they tell the story, don't make me sound brave. Tell them I was scared and tired and I wanted coffee and I was polite about it. That's the true version. That's the one that might actually help somebody someday, when they're scared and tired and standing in front of something too big to fight." I promised him I would, and this is me keeping that promise. Ending line. So that's the true version. No genius, no grand strategy, no hero, at least not the kind they put on statues. Just a frightened, tired, ordinary man, standing at the end of the world with the weight of 8 billion lives on his shoulders, who reached for the smallest human thing he could find to steady his shaking hands, who fixed a broken machine because he'd given his word, who came back with 2 cups instead of 1 because it seemed rude to bring only his own, and who, in doing all of that, without ever meaning to, reminded the oldest and coldest power in the universe of the one thing it had forgotten across 9 million years of ruling from a safe distance. That we are worth coming close to look at. That a thing which offers you coffee at the end of everything is not a fire to be put out, but a person, sitting across a table, saying please. They still have the cup, you know, the council. Somewhere out there, in whatever hall they keep the few things that ever changed them, sits a paper cup of coffee, gone cold 9 million years worth of ways, kept forever as the mark of the day a small tired man made the galaxy wait. And whenever I'm afraid now, truly afraid past scared, I do what he taught me. I stop. I find the smallest, most ordinary, most human thing within reach. And more often than not, God help me, it's a cup of coffee. I make it slowly. I offer some to whoever's nearby. And I remember that the whole future of our species once turned on exactly that, on one tired man refusing to stop being kind just because the universe had decided to be cruel. Fear only knows one word. Harlan knew a better one. He knew it right up to the end. And if you ever find yourself standing in front of something too big to fight, something certain it can end you, I hope you remember him, and I hope you remember the coffee, and I hope, more than anything, that you remember to offer some to whoever's standing next to you. Because that, it turns out, is the whole trick. That's the entire, ordinary, impossible secret. You stay yourself, you stay kind, and you make them come close enough to see it. That's what saved us, nothing more than that and nothing less.